Hello, welcome to the 13th episode of Scary Thoughts, Horror, Philosophy, Culture. I'm Marc Kate.
And I'm Chad Lott.
And in this episode, we're going to be talking about the 2008 film Pontypool. The next episode, we're going to be talking about Green Room from 2015, and we're going to be having the guest Eugene Robinson to come and talk to us about it, who I'm actually about to run out and see right after we record this episode. He's opening for Shoo Shoo down the street.
I've been a fan of that dude for a long time.
Yep.
I've read 2 of his books. Recently, I read Long and Slow Screw, which is a crime drama, like a noirish but hyper-violent book. It's set in like the late 70s New York. So it has that kind of like Goodfellas, early half of Goodfellas feel to it. It's pretty great. And then the book that he's probably most known for is Fight, everything you ever wanted to know about ass kicking, but were afraid you'd get your ass kicked for asking, which is kind of like a tough guy post-Fight Club book all about bare knuckle boxing and knife fighting and all kinds of other interesting pursuits. So I'm super excited to have him on.
So for this episode, this is the big spoiler alert. We are not doing a review of Pontypool. We are talking about Pontypool with you as if you've seen it and we've seen it. Also, there seems to be something going on in podcast land right now. It's like Teach Someone to Podcast Month, or I don't know if it's organized, but I found a lot of podcasts have been saying like, hey, you love podcasts. A lot of people don't even understand what they are. And I figure we should just take a moment and give lip service to that. Hey, consider turning someone on to podcasts. I mean, Scary Thoughts too, sure. But if you know someone who doesn't actually even understand how they work, you should totally teach them how it works. Because it really kind of is maybe a little daunting for some people that aren't like you and I.
Yeah, I mean, nothing changes a commute from dreary to decent like a podcast. I mean, it's almost the point now where there's just too much to listen to. I remember not even that long ago, I would like wait for a new episode of the Joe Rogan Experience to come out because there just wasn't anything else I really wanted to listen to. Now there's something like 350,000 podcasts out there in the podcast ecosystem. And if you're listening to this thinking that you want to start a podcast, do it. It's awesome. It's super fun. It's like being in a band. You get together with your friends and get on other people's podcasts, like be a guest on other people's shows. It's really, really a fun thing to do. And it helps you organize your thoughts and pick a niche, pick something you're super into and just go for it.
And specifically, honestly, if you're listening to this podcast and you're a fan of horror films and you're smart, make a horror film podcast. I wish there were more of them and I wish there were more good ones.
Yeah.
Join the party.
Yeah. Caveat to that is if you are an open mic comedian looking to work some material out on a horror movie podcast,
that's not
just
what I meant.
fucking stop. Just stop. Just stop. You're terrible.
Okay, so one place I would like to start with this movie,
sure,
unless you had a plug.
Oh, no, I don't have anything else. This is all I do.
Is that I went through a lot of reviews about this movie just to, like I do, just to see what other people have said about it. And I found there are 2 kinds of reviews about this movie. Reviews that quite liked it and came up with, a couple interesting things to say about it. And negative reviews that were written by hacks who are... is there a type of... hack probably covers it, but someone who writes reviews that are more about the reviewer trying to like spin puns and come up with clever turns of phrase to tear something apart. It's a very Pitchfork thing to do. But regardless of what it's called, I found the only negative reviews of this movie were those kinds of reviews, which I think is kind of awesome because it means the only time people could come up with anything bad to say was if they were clearly jerking off with a keyboard.
Yeah, I mean, that whole kind of like first person reviewer sort of thing, I just don't like it. It's like, I don't need to know anything about you. What are the merits of this film on its own? Like explain how it does or does not succeed. And I found really the only negative reviews I saw were people who this just wasn't quite their cup of zombie tea. Like a lot of the negative reviews I saw, and there were very little. I mean, this movie was really well regarded when it came out, and it seems to have only grown in popularity since.
It's the Get Out of 2008.
It kind of was, yeah. But, people who were like, oh, these just aren't the type of zombies I like. And
that's fair, whatever.
Fair enough, right? Because the movie does sort of get marketed as a zombie film, and the director likes to kind of refer to the I guess creatures or victims in the film as conversationalists, not zombies. But that doesn't make any sense to me because in the book they're explicitly referred to as zombies.
Yeah.
So I'm going to go on record as saying that this is a zombie film.
I think the conversationalists thing was that strikes me as being about the creative process and not about maybe how they want us to think about them, or maybe how they want us to think about them, but not necessarily refer. It's not necessarily creating some sort of no, it's not zombies anymore. It's this new thing.
Right.
I have a feeling the place you and I are most going to go on this film is to talk about Burroughs and language as a virus.
Yeah.
Am I correct?
Well, I mean, that's definitely one place I do want to hit on for sure. And that is the plot of this film, is that there's some sort of virus, some sort of mechanism that causes people to go crazy and eat each other. And it seems to come through language, specifically alliterative terms of endearment or rhetorical discourse, which is kind of funny because it's what is rhetorical discourse? It's just trying to convince somebody of something. So basically, if you're being sweet to someone or trying to convince them of something, which are really basically they're the two reasons why language exists, is to make people feel better or get them to do things, basically, So, I thought that in some of the interviews that I would have read with Tony Burgess, and he's one of these horror writers that is part of that whole scene of guys that just are really accessible to fans, which I think is kind of a cool,
definitely
modern thing.
And he gives a good interview.
Yeah, he's got a lot of really fun interviews. And, when I watched this movie, I actually experienced it in 3 different mediums. I watched the movie, I listened to the radio play edit of the movie, which is my favorite way of experiencing it.
It's really good.
And then I read the book. And the radio play, where you're just listening to the dialogue of the film with special effects, is, to me, far creepier than the film, and it's far creepier than the book. The book is just kind of madcap. It's just so all over the place. And when I was reading the book, I was like, oh, all these absurd, violent, weird situations that are just kind of crammed together with these odd connective tissue storylines. It reminds me of William Burroughs, and specifically the Nova trilogy. So Ticket Explodes, Nova Express. And I expected Tony Burgess to be like, Burroughs is my shit. I'm all about that. I totally did this with the cut-up method. But it turns out he was just read a bunch of Burroughs when he was younger and doesn't really think about him very much. It's just not that present.
I mean, I sort of think of this film, and obviously this is me making assumptions about someone's creative process, so I don't want to, I'm making an assumption, but okay, you know how there are a lot of films that seem like someone came up with the title first because it seemed like a cool idea and then wrote the movie later? I feel like movies like She's All That or Baby Mama or Hall Pass, some sort of expression in the common parlance, and some studio executive was like, everybody uses the expression baby mama now go write the movie, And I feel like Pontypool, similar but different, but was a little bit like, okay, Burroughs had this whole thing, language is a virus. Now, what if I wrote a book based on the idea that language is a virus, in a zombie sense, and kind of spun it from there. It all seems very premised on that one little idea. And then the book is very Burroughsian.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things he says that was in one of his interviews, that he talks about being really into tarot cards, which I thought was really weird. So I was like, why would you even mention that in this film? And it's something about these random communications that could have meaning or might have meaning. And then I started thinking about Philip K. Dick. He used the I Ching to write Man in the High Castle. So I'm wondering if maybe he used some sort of weird divination process, where he pulled out a card and it helped push the direction of the story. But the book really has no direction. And then the film really started its life as a radio play idea. So they had, the director had met Burgess at a party and offered him a chocolate egg for rights of the story. He didn't have any money at the time, but he's like, hey, look, man, I really like this. Probably no one else is going to buy this book, but here's a little chocolate egg that I picked up at the store. And it's just kind of like a promise. It's almost like a promise ring that he gave to the writer to develop this film. And so the first version of it they kind of get going is a radio drama for the BBC, and they're very influenced by the idea of War of the Worlds, that something is happening, it's probably maybe really happening, and so they get the radio drama pretty much worked out. And then they're like, okay, you know, for like a couple $100, we could probably just have a cameraman walk around while we do this and have most of a movie. And then at that point, they, you know, somebody else is like, well, how much money do you need to make it like that? And then the money falls into their lap, which I think is kind of an interesting way of developing this movie. And I don't think that if you had developed the book straight, it would have been nearly as successful as if it hadn't gone through this weird evolution, like this kind of like back end evolution. Because I think what the film Pontypool is a lot more successful than the book Pontypool is, to me anyway.
And they, you know, that there's like a part 2 and a part 3 ready to go.
And then the part 2 and part 3, like, is Pontypool changes, and then Pontypool changes everything. And they're supposed to kind of take place in the broader world of the book. And, you know, the zombies kind of get a little wilder as they kind of advance in their zombie-ness, to the point of almost being like these weird creatures. And there's all kinds of weird, surreal shit that happens in the book. Like this brother and sister that like disappears into the woods and develops this incestuous relationship with each other, and they survive by eating zombies that they capture. And they have like a sexual affair, and the girl gets pregnant, and then she like births a baby, and the baby like hits the ground running and is like a zombie baby from like the jump. So it's kind of like Dead Alive, sort of. And I don't know, I just don't know how that's going to be filmed. And I feel like that the part 2 and part 3 might lean heavier on the book, but I hope they do something kind of different with it.
Yeah. Well, I'd love to get more into the Burroughs thing, actually, and, you know, Burroughs' concerns and Tony Burgess, the author and screenwriter's concerns, because it seems like, I mean, it's odd that you say that he doesn't necessarily... The Nova trilogy is all about social control.
Yep.
And that's really Grant Mazzy, the main character of Pontypool's thing. I mean, he's like kind of the shock jock, and the first shock jockey thing he does is to like call out the OPP, making jokes about them all being alcoholics, and it backfires because one of them is.
2 of them are.
Oh, 2 of them were.
Yeah.
Oh, shit.
There's basically no one in this small little town that doesn't have some fucked up secret. Like there's 2 alcoholics, there's a pedophile, you know, there's all these like really dark characters that exist in this tiny little town. And then it has like it's basically on the outskirts, there's this weird off-camera rural horror element that could have played out without the zombies even.
Right.
Like with Grant Mazzy finding himself in this hostile environment, you know, of small town. Like one of the things I love that Sidney Breyer, the show producer, says to him is like, we don't want full disclosure, we want school closure. And it's like kind of plays onto that alliteration that's all throughout the film, which I think is really, it's so well written. Like there's just so much great dialogue, and just the turns of phrases are so interesting. But it's like he has come from the big city, probably been unseated for some reason. You know, there's a Don Imus quality to him with the cowboy hat. So you imagine in this day and age, he could have probably had said something, and his career is destroyed, and now he's in this shit little town, basically almost like a no exit hell for him. You know, he's been cast down, and then he's basically this representation of kind of anarchy. He's like a punk character, right? He has a Joey Ramone statue on his desk, and he's wearing this like flashy, almost Al Jorgensen Ministry outfit, sort of, and it's like he is this weird disruptive element in this small town. Yeah.
So I have a bunch more to say sort of on the virus and Burroughs thing.
I mean, like you were saying a second ago, like the Nova Express thing is like in the book, like there's a Nova gang, and so they're always trying to disrupt things, and like the basic Nova technique is like always create as many insoluble conflicts as possible and always aggravate existing conflicts, which is, you know, like it's so interesting watching this movie now that we've had this like super weaponized talk radio everywhere experience with the past election. Is, you know, there's one scene where one of the characters says, you know, you have to stop talk radio because it's just too dangerous. And it's kind of a funny line then, but now it means even more. So I'm wondering if that's where you're going to go with it.
Yeah, but actually even more fundamentally, I'm still just finding more correlations with source material. You know, in William Burroughs' Cities of the Red Night, he writes, changes can only be affected by alterations in the original. The only thing not pre-recorded in a pre-recorded universe are the pre-recordings themselves. The copies can only repeat themselves word for word. A virus is a copy. You can pretty it up, cut it up, scramble it up. It will reassemble in the same form. And I think, again, that feeds right into it. Or I think he wrote it before that, but in The Ticket That Exploded, which is part of the Nova trilogy, he was very plain spoken about it when he said, the word is now a virus. The flu virus may once have been a healthy lung cell. Now it is a parasitic organism that invades and damages the lungs. The word may once have been a healthy neural cell. Now it is a parasitic organism that invades and damages the central nervous system. And again, that's exactly how this functions in this movie. I also think it's interesting you brought up Philip K. Dick and the cut-up method. And I think that this movie is very much about speaking like a cut-up and separating words from their meanings and fracturing semiotic consistency as a survival mechanism.
And Burroughs studied semiotics formally.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, he's fully there.
Yeah.
Totally. And I think that translates to the fact that a lot of language nerds are super into this movie. But Philip K. Dick actually wrote about Burroughs' whole virus thing. He wrote in a letter to somebody, I don't know who, but he wrote, I cannot accept Burroughs' view that we have been invaded by an alien virus. Actually, that was part of Burroughs' thing, is it wasn't only always language is a virus. It was sometimes language is a virus from outer space.
Yeah.
But I cannot accept Burroughs' view that we've been invaded by an alien virus, an information virus. Yet, on the other hand, I cannot readily dismiss this bizarre theory as mere paranoia on his part. I think he's onto something real and important. And that is his statements do more good, far more good than harm. That is, he states the problem correctly, although perhaps his analysis of the cause is faulty. Still, merely to be aware of the problem is to achieve a great deal.
Yeah, that immediately makes me think of Snow Crash, which is, there's one intertextual moment in this film. There's
the Neil Stephenson.
Yeah, Neil Stephenson Snow Crash. There's, in one scene, Snow Crash is sitting on a table between two of the characters, and so it's just sitting there. And
in Pontypool, you mean?
In Pontypool, it's actually on a table. And what that book's about is there is a language virus that comes from an ancient Sumerian god, and so it has a lot to do with that book, The Origin of Consciousness, and the breakdown of the bicameral mind. So there's this theory that, and this is in Westworld too. This is kind of one of the things in Westworld.
That's where it came up recently.
Yeah.
Yes.
So this idea that human consciousness was at one point split between sort of every, animal concerns, there's the food, I need the food. And then your higher thought wasn't actually you. It was this separate thought that people kind of thought were the gods. And so in some ways you could say okay, the brain is hardware, and then this consciousness is software. And so it could be reprogrammed in different ways. So in ancient Sumeria, there was this thing called the me, and it was basically the directions of the gods. So maybe the philosophy as handed down by the gods. And there were these different gods that sort of had different ideas. And so this is maybe a different myth got its way into the human consciousness and formed human consciousness. So Snow Crash is kind of all about this virus that's that comes in. And the whole point of the virus in Snow Crash is to completely reprogram the human race to some sort of effect. And you see that in this film. Dr. Mendez, the character Dr. Mendez, says, it's trying to change our reality. It's this God virus. And so you have Snow Crash, William Burroughs, this book, it all is about this virus from outer space.
Actually, I have one more, which this reminded me very much of an Octavia Butler short story that was in the compilation Bloodchild that came out long before Pontypool Changes Everything, called Speech Sounds, which is about our world falling apart because there's some sort of pandemic that destroys people's ability to communicate via speech or language in general. And it just sort of takes this slice of life as everything's decaying and what people are doing about it when no one can actually talk or write.
And you see it kind of demonstrated, and Grant Mazzy has this really interesting ability in the film to listen to somebody while speaking at the same time. So it almost had this weird feeling. I mean, I don't know if that's just something that radio people can do, but I can barely look at my notes and have a conversation at the same time.
Totally.
And so he has this sort of weird ability to split his attention and consciousness kind of, and it almost seems to be the thing that protects him from being infected by the virus, because he opens the film, it's his voice saying all these alliterative words of sweetness. They're talking about honey the cat, honey, 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 honey. And if there's anybody who should have been infected, it should have been him. But there's something about him that prevents him from being infected.
So here's a possible thing. He potentially created the cure, or, maybe other people figured the cure out elsewhere. It's hard to know. But he might have caused this because the film starts where there's the pre-roll tape. There's that Honey the Cat is playing when he's driving and when he sees the first victim. Is it possible that his pre-roll tape was the cause of the epidemic? I mean, I'm totally stretching, but his pre-roll tape, his Pontypool speech, actually has all the triggers in it. And it is the first thing we encounter in the film, and it's playing when we see the first victim.
Yeah, I mean, because it's clear, clearly as to the film, nothing's happening before that, right? And, according to the book, the play, and also the film, it all kicks off in Pontypool. It spreads especially as the post-credit sequence happens, and there's the voiceovers in the credits. You can tell it has sort of escaped Pontypool and is moving on, as zombie outbreaks tend to do. Yeah, Mazzy is such an interesting character, and the actor Stephen McHattie, he's been in 1,000 things. His IMDb is 40 pages long, but he is so good in this.
He's so good.
His voice is great. The little twitches of his face when stuff's going off the rails. I mean, just so good.
Yeah, I think so much of the strength of this film is the fact that most of it is a close-up of his face, because he's so good on screen. He just controls his voice and his face so beautifully that it's really mesmerizing.
Yeah, and really, I always think that if you have a strong cast and a good script, you could make a classic horror film. You don't really need a whole lot else. I mean, this movie, not really a whole lot of really extra special effects. I mean, there's some gore effects or whatever, but this movie is really, really solid, and it doesn't have a whole lot. I mean, I love films that take place in single locations.
Yeah.
And it's so interesting because then the directors get to make all these cool choices, okay, how are we going to film this close up? Not just is there a close up or not. It's is it a wide angle close up? Is it zoom in close up? And there's just so much innovative shit that you don't even notice going on in this film. And it appears simple, but it's just not. And then the other characters, Lisa Houle plays Cindy Breyer. She's great in this. She's sort of the man. She's trying to tell him what to do. She's obviously being given this prima donna, and she's been running the station for 17 years at least, because that's how long she's known the Sunshine Weather Reporter guy. And you have Laurel Ann, who's some sort of, she's been in the Canadian military and she's seen some shit in Afghanistan. And I was very surprised that military experience didn't play out at all in the film. I expected her to kind of be this kind of new, this Neo final girl type thing that we have in film, where there's a super competent female badass.
Yeah,
I expected that to happen, and then she just goes out as tragically as anybody does.
Well, you see her. It's hard to notice the first time you watch the film, but when you rewatch it, you see when she becomes infected. She gets this call that she takes that you don't hear, and she gets this weird expression on her face and hangs up the phone, and it's clear that's when she got infected, and it's pretty damn early in the film.
Yeah.
And it clearly keeps her from asserting agency until she really flips.
Yeah, and I love when she finally does kind of cross over, is she's mimicking the sound of the tea kettle. It's such a creepy scene.
Right.
It's just a simple...
Yeah.
It's almost like something out of a dream. You would be oh, and it was crazy in my dream. Then you open your mouth, it was like a tea kettle.
It's good sound design.
It's good sound design. And in the headphones, if you watch this movie on your computer and you have your headphones on, it's a headphone movie. I don't know that I've ever thought of any movie as a headphone movie.
Totally. One thing I will say about the tea kettle thing is that and the windshield wipers, they're imitating windshield wipers, are breaks from the way in which this is about language and about communicating something. I mean, we can sort of spin a tea kettle as being a piece of information in some way, but that makes the virus about sound, not about language specifically. Yep. I just think it's sort of and I don't think it breaks the rules. I think it just bends the rules in a way that it doesn't simplistically answer.
Yeah, I thought about that like thing, because when they talk about the windshield wipers and then the one character is stuck in a silo with a kid who's turned over and he's making these like weird doll noises, I really did think about those things. They're imitating just noises. And so is this any sort of actual intelligence, this virus thing? Is it from something? But then you're like, okay, it has to do with terms of endearment, and it kicks off on Valentine's Day. So if you were going to have like a language weapon that was mobilized by terms of endearment, you would want to roll it out on Valentine's Day. So yeah, I don't know. I love that it's just not explained. And then Tony Burgess is just not in the business of explaining things.
Yeah.
And part of that has to do with, like, have you ever heard of Alfred Jarry?
Burroughs?
Yeah. So the thing that he talked about in several interviews is being just super into pataphysics and Alfred Jarry's work and this whole absurdism and weirdness and things don't have to be explained. And, you know, I'm sure like this is obscure enough to maybe warrant a little bit of explanation to the audience. So one way people define this branch of, I guess, art metaphysics, I don't even know. It's so obscure.
From early 20th century.
Yeah, it's super weird. It was kind of came around in the time in like Paris when like all the theater was super odd and avant-garde, and it's like all this Baudelairean crazy stuff, and you know all these like absinthe freaks with their long hair and their velvet coats. So it's very, very sexy. But, you know, they talk about pataphysics as a branch of philosophy or science that examines imaginary phenomena that exist in a world beyond metaphysics. It's a science of imaginary solutions. And, you know, if you have imaginary problems, like a word virus, you know, the solutions for them are imaginary. The meaning that you might ascribe to it is also imaginary in a weird way, which is completely in line with like semiotic work. So we're sitting here and, you know, dumping all of our ideas on this film. And Tony Burgess, with all of his schooling and background and knowledge of all this stuff, designed something that is made to like resist and compel you to do that sort of thing.
Yeah, you know, it's funny you should put it that way, because I found that the first maybe 2 or 3 times I saw it, I always felt like, oh, I really like this, but I'm missing something. Like, I think I need to see it again to get this, like, to cross over, to understand some part of it that I'm not getting. And maybe if I read the book, or maybe if I watch a bunch of interviews, and after spending all this time trying to decode it a little more, there's no there. Right. It's not about that. It's actually about not that, which, if I may, something that Burgess actually talks about is that, you know, we talked about when we did our Return of the Living Dead episode, which is that zombies are usually this metaphor for something else. It's to talk about globalization. It's to talk about consumerism. But for Burgess in Pontypool, zombies are a metaphor for metaphors.
Yeah, totally.
Which takes a while to get one's head around. But like, yeah, absolutely. And therefore trying to like have some sort of aha on the totality of Pontypool. No, there is none. Yeah. It's a semiotic game that will always undo itself.
Yeah.
And that's part, to me, of, in Pontypool, the sower of chaos of Pontypool. The only way to fight it, the only way to fight this virus is with linguistic chaos, right? It's the only way you can sort of like undo the undoing.
Yeah. And the whole idea of like, you know, like these semiotic games is like, okay, he's created things that are basically zombies, right? But they're also not zombies, but some characters call them zombies. So it's kind of like, does it even matter? Like they're eating the faces of other people.
In the book, they call them
zombies. In the book, they're zombies,
yeah.
But they're acting like zombies in the movie too. Like the banging on the window.
Yeah.
These are all symbols of zombies, you know, like, but it's also not a zombie. You know, so you're kind of like taking all this stuff you know about genre and applying it to this thing that was made to not be like a genre thing. And so you're trying to figure out what's going on. And this is one of the ideas of pataphysics, is that like everything in the universe is kind of considered like an extraordinary event. So you can always read pataphysics is almost like designed to make you want to do close, insane readings of things. Like you're always like looking for deeper meaning.
Like Scientology.
Yeah, totally. And the meaning's there, but it's also not there, like Scientology. But in the opening scene, you know, he says that thing about Norman Mailer, you know, and he talks about like JFK coincidences and things that appear related. It's like, what does it mean? Something's going to happen, something big, but then something's always going to happen. You know, and that's how this thing kicks off. And you're like, okay, well, something's happening but then something's always happening, but it's something big, and then this movie just rolls out as a horror movie, but it's quite different than a normal horror movie.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of the way in which this approaches horror, again, Tony Burgess, the writer, talks about having lived through, like, an origin of this movie is he lived through this year where he had difficulty speaking because he had this, like, unyielding, pernicious sound in his head.
Yeah.
Did you come across
this?
Yeah. That's super crazy. Like, he had, like, this muffled scream in his head that wouldn't go away for a year. So with this film, he's really coming at it from a place of, like, genuine horror. He created this story and this film that aren't about the fear of being attacked by zombies so much as it's about being attacked by a horror, by, you know, the fears of the virus, not as much of getting eaten by zombies.
And that's why I can refer to them or think of the characters that turn over as victims rather than monsters. The virus is the scary thing. And the whole thing about his, like, personal experience with this weird ear noise, I've noticed that, like, very successful horror stories seem to be based on a very concrete fear of the creator of the story. You know, like, you look at the Lovecraft mythos, it's all about, like, fear of, like, these alien things coming, and then he, you know, is way over concerned with, like, alien races moving into his neighborhood, you know? And, like, it's almost like it being rooted in the actual real discomfort gives it this, like, oomph.
Yeah. I don't want to go on record talking about specifics of altered states, but I don't do well with them. And so part of the film that really resonated with me of, like, this fear of losing one's sense of reality was really palpable.
Yeah, and in the book, the protagonist that you get at the beginning, when there is one protagonist, is schizophrenic or something. He has some sort of slipping. And then
what's his name?
Les Reardon.
That's it.
Who is he's like a local theater director. You know, so he's gone through some sort of emotional break, and he comes back, and through the church or something like that, he gets introduced to this position, and then he's like the town theater critic, which is pretty funny because that survives in a way in the film as the Lawrence of Arabia production, which is such an odd thing in the film.
I don't know if people noticed this, but Tony Burgess, the writer of the book and the writer of the screenplay, is the guy in brown face playing Lawrence of Arabia.
He's not Osama bin Laden, who's the guy standing
other
next
guy.
to him.
Like, I know I'm gonna put on brown face. I want to be in the movie.
Yeah.
What a weird fucking choice. I cannot get my head around.
Yeah, and like that I think might be one of the best scenes in the movie, because the look on Grant Mazzy's face of just, like, it's actually, like, up there as one of the moments of sheer horror. Like, he's actually horrified by what he's looking at.
It's terrible.
You know, and he's, like, holding up the phone to his agent or something like that, and he's like, listen to this. And the characters, you know, in the way that a small town production would be, like, there's, like, this waiting for Guffman quality to this production that is just, these people are so earnest, and they're singing, and it's just terrible. I mean, it's a really terrible song, and I don't even know that there's a Lawrence of Arabia musical. I don't know if that's a thing that exists.
I hope so.
I don't want to know if it's not. But that happens, and then, you know, one of the most violent deaths is actually one of these little girls. You know, like, there's a few deaths you see in the film, but the only time they, like, get a zombie really is one of the little girls, and it seems like such...
She's great.
Yeah.
Watching her transform, she's so in that moment.
Yeah, she's terrifying. Like, when she turns around and just repeats the thing, and to repeat something back is such a odd, weird stalling tactic, and it kind of works, like, because they freeze for a moment, and then she's, like, on them in 2 seconds, like any other awesome zombie. And the scene that unfolds after that's kind of interesting. Like, they start to, like, stomp her to death, and then Grant Mazzy blinks off the screen for a moment, and then they both blink back on the screen, and they're both, like, him and the show producer are, like, stomping the kid to death. And then the whole next 10 minutes is kind of talking about who actually caused the death of the child, which is super weird, because it's like, hey, look, you just got attacked by basically a monster, and you're, like, hashing out your story for the cops, and then also using it as a bargaining chip to decide who's going to kill the doctor next. it's just such an odd moment for the film.
So I thought the doctor was interesting and slightly problematic. He's the one who was arrested for fraudulent prescriptions or something.
Yeah, he's under investigation for writing unnecessary prescriptions.
Yes. And you see him popping pills during this movie.
Yep.
And so this is me riffing. I could be there, but he's the painkiller addict. And like Burroughs, the junkie, he's able to see things as they really are. Like that's kind of part of Burroughs' contra mind control, is to be able to see things as they really are, to know people as they really are. And Dr. Mendez is possibly the same, and it might be just a little nod to Burroughs that it's because he's high on prescription heroin.
Yeah.
I mean, although it's actually the shock jock that has the big realization about the cure. And he's not an Alex Jones, but he's definitely an anti-control voice that sees through the lies. But again, it's Dr. Mendez. It's often a kind of lazy script writing thing where you have the authority come in and they do this exposition and they explain exactly what's happening with this alien race or alien menace or whatever.
Yeah.
Someone to come in and just like move the plot along because they're the expert, and somehow this small town doctor just happens to have all this insight and be super curious. Like, he's got an accent.
Well, he's Armenian.
But he would almost be like German.
Yeah.
Like the German scientist who understands things.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. Like, he's the one who calls it like a god bug. And then the first mass event happens around his doctor office. So, it could be that just people are just going there for treatment or something like that. Or has he possibly caused something, in some sort of weird Germany experimentation. And it's an interesting character because he kind of saves them or tries to save them by like leading the zombies off. He just runs out and yells something. And he's just such a bizarre character. In the book, he's completely different. He's just doing autopsies. And so his autopsies that he's performing on these characters sort of take the place of in the film when Grant Mazzy reads the obituaries. Yeah, which is a really cool part of the movie.
It's probably my favorite part of the movie. It's like this non sequitur, but it's really effective. It's super creepy, and it is definitely the Yarzy reader of this movie. Just it's kind of trucking along, and then all of a sudden, like there are obituaries of people who they have no way of knowing died, shot in a completely different style from the rest of the film, and it's really beautiful. Yeah, being the only Canadian in the room. I think actually you asked me off mic if there was anything about this that was particularly Canadian to me, or I can't remember. Did you?
Well, our show that we both like, Faculty of Horror, it's Canadian horror podcast, and they made a lot of the Canadianness of this film, and that's just something that's just impenetrable to me. And then I looked into it, and I just didn't think that I could speak to it at all. But it was something that like some heavy hitter horror thinkers really seemed was important to bring up. And you being Canadian, I was curious if it, like, because there's the thing about the French separatists.
Well, that's the only thing that resonated. I think that it would be like, okay, you and I are recording this in the Mission right now. And what if this movie Pontypool is about this like pirate radio station, and they were like, yeah, after tomorrow morning, I'm going to go down to Grand Coffee and get a cappuccino. And, would you immediately go like, oh, they totally get San Francisco. This is such a San Francisco movie. It's like, no, it just, it's just about if you name the location.
Right.
Well, it's like, well, this film is Canadian. That doesn't make it especially Canadian to me.
Right.
Does that make sense?
I was also like, what does it even mean to have like a Canadian film? And all I could think of was that like the film is sort of state sponsored.
Oftentimes it is. Canadian films tend to garner less funding and garner fewer ticket sales. But it was the separatist thing that I thought was the most interesting, because Canada has issues around language, which, as we know, is a virus that America does not have. And that's because of Quebec and the history of the separatists in Quebec. And that definitely resonates with me. Well, remember when the BBC calls in and they seem to know actually more than Grant Mazzy. And one of the things that...
Or they're making more fake news than Grant Mazzy is, because they sort of don't really know what's going on. They're just asserting things on the news.
Oh, that's true.
Yeah.
But they do know that the French-Canadian Army, or whatever he could terms it, are advancing. And it does seem that that's actually happening at the end of the film.
Yeah.
But what that BBC announcer says, your country's history of separatist terror. And I was born in Montreal, which is in Quebec. But my parents left Quebec in 71, the year I was born, 6 months later. And the reason why is because the separatists were kidnapping and killing people and setting off bombs to try and separate Quebec from the rest of Canada. Like, it was getting violent in Quebec. So my parents were like, out of here, and basically moved us to the suburbs of Toronto, which Pontypool is a suburb. Well, Pontypool's not quite a suburb of Toronto. It's a little too far, but it's about an hour and a half out of Toronto. And my family moved me from where the separatist violence was to 20 minutes outside the core of Toronto in 71. Oh, it was totally real. Yeah, it was like my parents had a life and were starting a family, and were like, fuck this, and left. So that's where it overlapped for me, but also how it overlaps for, speaks to the Canadianness of this film, is the way that language is a very singular issue in Canada in the way that a lot of other countries might not sort of appreciate in a similar way.
Yeah, it's peculiar in the film that French is sort of this refuge in the film. Like, it's a safe spot for them to converse, and they use French to sort of get around the virus. And you have Grant Mazzy kind of representing this C student approach, where he just has this very rudimentary French, and then the other characters that are bilingual have an advantage. And so it's like this sololingual or maybe like monocultural outlook is actually precarious in the film.
Yeah. So we were talking earlier about the radio play that was made of this, which I think we both agree like really works. This movie really works.
Yeah.
The radio play was different. It ends differently. There were a couple of different scenes. From doing a reading online, I couldn't tell if the radio play version of this was actually a completely separate recording, or if they took parts of the movie and then added some other dialogue to it.
So did you listen to the one I sent you?
I don't think so. Maybe.
Okay, so there's a BBC edit that I just wasn't able to find. Like, so there was an actual recording, and I don't know if it exists or not even. Like, what I listened to, though, was some fan edit that somebody had just basically...
That's what I probably heard.
Yeah. So I listened to that, and then it basically leaves out the countdown bombing is what it does. So it just kind of ends with, the Sydney Brier is alive, and it almost ends like, if you're familiar with the film enough, the radio edit that I listened to sort of ends with them in the room, more or less, and then things happen, and it seems to be spiraling out of control. But
Grant Mazzy succumbs to the virus in the radio play.
Right.
He gets stuck on the word paper and turns into one of them. But there's also another thing. Laura Land's death is very, very different in the radio play.
Yeah.
So there's clearly other recordings going on.
Yeah, and one of the things I thought was kind of interesting about the actual recording of it is that some of the sound is from the microphones that are in it, and then some of it's just from boom mics and stuff and that. So, and they were kind of cagey. The director was kind of cagey about like what was from what, but he mentioned it was nice to have all these different edits. But so I think there might be quite a bit of extra footage and extra sound floating around to make things like this with,
which is super interesting. I think, and thinking of this as a radio play, I feel like the part that was most radio play about the film itself is when he's talking to Ken in the Sunshine Chopper.
Yes,
because those scenes are like, you just hear this disembodied voice going like, okay, now this is happening, and now this is happening, and I can see this, and it's very radio play-ish. Yeah. So it ends up actually kind of being play within a play. But speaking of all of this, you and I have been talking about possibly covering Welcome to Night Vale, the podcast, as a possible future episode. And I just kind of want to put it out there to our listeners. Should we do that? Does that sound good to you? If like no one responds, maybe we should skip it. But if there's even a couple of people out there who are like super into Welcome to Night Vale, or could be edged into giving that podcast a shot, I'd be really into discussing a pretty interesting, basically radio play / podcast.
Well, I love Welcome to Night Vale, and I didn't want to like it because before I ever heard it, I had heard an interview with one of the creators, and he's like one of these like MFA writers, and I have this grudge against MFA people coming into horror and genre stuff because the entire process of MFA writing, the entire schooling, like every single MFA program I've ever looked at has just this right out the gate, don't even fucking bother if you're interested in writing genre stuff here. Like they all have an explicit thumbs down to that sort of material. And that's all I've ever been interested in writing about. Like I'm writing horror stories right now and it's super fun and I love it. And so I was like, man, these dudes are fucking interlopers. Fuck these guys. And then I listened to it and it's great. I mean, the language is so good. And I'm really surprised that they're not deep genre fans. At least in the interviews I read, like they're just not that deep into like horror. Like certainly not as much as we are, but they pull off this great horror, or not even horror, but this weird fiction thing. Yeah. And I think it's a great genre piece. And the fact that it kind of slips into the real world a little bit, like it's buoyed up into pop culture by fan art more than anything else. And that to me is very fascinating about how this one piece can slip into these multiple formats. And I think that's one of the things about Pontypool is it exists in all these multiple formats. And, you know, you can't get much more Canadian than Marshall McLuhan, you know, and like that whole medium is the message thing with Pontypool and Welcome to Night Vale, and there's Welcome to Night Vale books that are very good. Yeah. And just this whole cross media franchise thing is really kind of neat to me. I mean, you even see it now with like all the new Star Wars films. Like the plot is developing in a TV show, Star Wars Rebels, while simultaneously there's these films and multi timelines running. It's neat, I think. And I think the return to audio only is very interesting.
Yeah. Actually, you know what? Let's just say we're doing it.
Yeah.
Hey, listeners, go check it out. And I would probably say you don't need to listen to all of them.
Certainly not.
Yeah, I think we would be talking about the thing of Welcome to Night Vale and not the entire every damn episode. This is a lot. There's a lot of text to cover there.
Yeah. So, I mean, what do you think about the post-credit sequence in Pontypool?
Okay, so I hope everybody actually saw that. So
yeah, so a lot of people are not familiar with it.
Right. I mean, it's like a Marvel movie. You gotta wait through the credits until you see. I'm
glad you brought up that it's like a Marvel movie because I have something to say about that.
Okay. The post-credit sequence, I don't get it. It's like the ultra non sequitur to me, and I think that the only thing I can kind of point out about it is the most obvious thing is that she says honey, he goes shh, because it's a term of endearment, right, which connects it to the entire film, and then the final card is fin, which is French for end. So it's ending with a French word, but in text, not even spoken. I think that part of it's interesting, but the sort of like noir, hyper stylized, it almost looks like Sin City or something like that.
It really looks like Sin City.
I kind of didn't get it.
Yeah, and I don't think you can get it. I think it's just one of these little playful things. I think about like from the way the film ends, there's like the countdown, the 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, but it's in French. Yeah. And then something happens. You just imagine there's like a bomb, which is very Return of the Living Dead. Yeah. The way it ends. And then the credits run with this sort of like developing virus spreading, which you see in Night of the Living Dead. And you also see in the remake of Day of the Dead, the one in the mall. Yeah. So there's this sort of zombie movie tradition of the virus spreading through the credits, right? And
which, if I may, the credits part ends with a British voice. I don't know if it's that guy who called
Nigel Farage.
Yes. Yeah. I can't quite tell if it's actually him, but it is an English news reporter who starts getting caught in his own language. So it spread, and so it seems to me that Grant.
Right. Back to your theory of Grant Massey being the problem.
Grant spread it to the UK.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah. So there's a lot of writing online about what it means. And I think it's just easy enough to say, like, listening to Tony Burgess, knowing about his interest in semiotics and all of his other stuff, it just has no real meaning. It has no, like, real super depth. It's just kind of an interesting thing at the end. And also, people are like, oh, it doesn't fit the rest of the movie. Well, it seems like something that could easily have happened in the book. There are moments where in the book just a character is doing a completely different thing than they were earlier in the book. And you're like, what the fuck is even going on? Like, there's a moment where the main character, Les Riordan, has shot somebody, has his heroin addicted baby that he's picked up from the crack house where his mother was living, and is running around like basically trying to rescue this baby while shoving Dilaudid down its mouth. And then he gets captured. Then all of a sudden he's doing something else, so there's this jumping around. And so Burgess said that the movie could really be thought of as a chapter that the book forgot to include.
Yeah.
So it's just, it doesn't really have any sort of anything to it. But there's the other idea that he has completely shifted meaning around so much in his head to avoid the virus that he's now shifted into an alternate reality, which is one of the fan theories that I ran across that I kind of liked the most.
Right.
Was that he's just completely altered everything. And then, there are even different characters. He's Johnny Deadeyes and she's Lisa the Killer.
Right.
It doesn't mean anything. And he is so open to talking about fucking everything, but he's like, oh, I hate that question. I don't even answer it. So it's like, okay, so I guess.
Well, I mean, I think that the take that it doesn't mean anything is sort of the best answer because, his character repeatedly goes back to that, what does it mean? And I think, the answer to all of it is it doesn't mean anything. It's about undoing meaning. It is the understanding of meaning that causes the virus in the first place, ostensibly.
Yeah, and then it's also possible that, like a Marvel Comics movie, that the next version of Pontypool changes. It's right there in the title. It could enter into this super weird, surreal space where, these are the main characters now, and they are played by the same people, because that happens in the book a little bit, like where the same character is now doing something completely different, or a character who was living a second ago is now dead and on the autopsy table, and it's just moved around, or experiencing a completely different reality. So imagine like a really Sin City visual looking version of Pontypool where all the zombie outbreaks happening everywhere, and now there's these like noirish characters leading it. It's totally in the spirit of Burgess's career.
Well, again, the other scene that is completely unlike the rest of the film, I wanted to go back to the obituaries. You know what I said a minute ago, that the first scene has his pre-recorded tape about Pontypool and Honey the Cat, but actually that's before the first scene. That's over the squiggly line, the audio rendering. But actually the first scene in the film, when he's in the car and talking to his manager, it's the obituaries that's playing over. And so I think it's interesting that we start the film with these obituaries that if you listen, it's actually like, lived to the age of this, is survived by these people. And it's all about affirming life and longevity. And then the obituaries that are plunked in the middle of the film are all about died by this hand of so-and-so and was immediately killed by this person who then went on to kill these people. And it's real obituaries. It's just death, 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 death. Like everybody's just dead.
And who's reporting those? That's the other thing that's kind of funny.
It's great. It's totally great. But that is actually the opposite of the thing that Grant Mazzy repeats, which is Sidney Breyer is alive, Sidney Breyer is alive, Sidney Breyer is alive, which is the opposite of an obituary. It's an affirmation of life.
Right. Yeah, and one of the reasons why he does that is because he's trying to get it out to her kids. But I think it's pretty clear that her kids contract the virus when she's talking to them on the phone.
Honey, 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 honey.
And
or sweetie.
Yeah, she keeps using just all of it. And then the kids, she loses them on the phone. But I feel like maybe they've contracted the virus and she knows it. But she's trying to let, the family know. And he's almost using Sidney Breyer is alive as like a lifeboat. Because one, it actually does drive the zombies away to go chase after that sound. But then, it's sort of this, he's trying to get her to not lose her shit, because that character is very much in danger of like losing her grip a few times, especially after they kill the brown-faced Muslim.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So speaking of like the flocking of all of these zombies, in the Return of the Living Dead episode, we were talking about zombie firsts. There's, of course, this timeline of the invention of the slow walking zombie, which is Romero's thing. And then Return of the Living Dead came along and introduced the fast running zombie. And then I was saying like, oh, and World War Z introduced the swarm, right? You get enough fast moving zombies. It's actually something entirely different than even Return of the Living Dead. It's a swarm. They can pile up on each other. And it didn't occur to me that this movie, you don't see it, but it precedes the World War Z swarm, because there's a description of Dr. Mendez's office exploding from within of bodies. And there are several descriptions of just like bodies everywhere. And that's, I think, the first instance we get in zombie cinema, even though it's described, of essentially a swarm of bodies on top of bodies on top of bodies.
Yeah,
zombies.
In the book, he calls it an alliterative fog of zombies.
Oh, that's so good.
Yeah.
One thing that I really appreciate about this movie, that I really wish more horror movies took seriously, is so much for me that is interesting about horror cinema is, and I've said this before, is that because they're often quite low budget, there's a lot of inventiveness that takes place that births unique problem solving and unique ideas. And what I really appreciate about this film is they had a really limited budget and they were prepared to have less.
Yeah, he was like $200 and we'll shoot this.
Yeah. But I'm just going to say most horror movies do, when they have a very limited budget, is try to make the film look like it's more expensive than it is by doing things like throwing in CGI. So at least there's something like really explosive or cool and weird and, extreme, and it just looks shittier. It actually makes it look cheaper when they try to make it look like more. Pontypool, it is exactly what it is. It's a super cheap film and it's a bunch of people in a room. There are a few effects and they're super basic and super effective, and they're convincing as a result of it, because it stays within the world that they're able to genuinely create with a very limited budget.
Yeah, like after Laurel Ann eats the radio or whatever she does, which is hilarious and metaphor written, her mouth split open effect is really good. I mean, it's super creepy. It's gross.
It's really gross.
And then you feel bad for her because you sort of... Another thing these low budget movies have the opportunity to do is you get to know the characters before bad things happen to them, which is pretty cool. And like in Cabin in the Woods, those characters are very realized before everybody starts dying. And then go back to your Dr. Mendez, the drugs giving him a view into the reality as it is. I mean, that's what happens in Cabin in the Woods. The stoner character is, he's like freed from the grip of enforced reality and able to see beyond to the great old
consensus reality.
Consensus reality, I guess, yeah.
And speaking of that consensus reality and being high, I think other than the obituaries, one of my actually favorite parts in the movie is when Ken from the Sunshine Chopper is describing the scene, and he's like, it's like fish trying to eat their way inside. And this is about when Grant starts to lose his grip, and he stares at his hand for like a really long time. And it's such this like moment of like when you're on mushrooms and trying to come to grips with reality is falling apart, and you sort of ground yourself in your own body and then end up losing yourself in the surrealness of your own body.
Yeah. That scene too, it reminded me of like somebody who had maybe had some experience with those substances would be like, I'm just going to check in with my little personal psychedelic barometer here, which is my hand melting, But then there's also kind of like, what is his relationship with drugs maybe? Because when they roll out the pot bust, he adds on this extremely purple description of the dangers of hometown pot growers. And he asks Sydney Brier, do you smoke pot? And she's like, yes. And it's all on air. Like, that's one of the things that's kind of funny is like, okay, well, you have the station manager admitting that she smoked.
Wait, was that on the air? I thought that was just in his cans.
It must, it must be just in his cans. In the radio, it's harder to tell in the radio edit version because
that's true.
You're just hearing it. So, and I think I liked it better when it was just explicit and out in the radio edit version. I don't know. But yeah, it's probably just in his headphones.
Yeah.
Well, something I was kind of resistant to bring up because it's sort of not part of the canon of the film, but you could just add on to it is how we're existing in this like meme war culture right now. And, from the whole Richard Dawkins book, Selfish Gene, the meme is just this self-replicating, maybe contagious idea. And there's some people that have the idea that this stuff is actually alive, that these ideas actually have they function sort of like organisms. They like look for hosts to stay in, and their virility is demonstrated in the duration of their contact with human idea. So Christianity might be a very long-lived meme. It's a very powerful meme, whereas the I do what I want girl that's like parodied in South Park, like that's a short-term meme, although it's still around. I just mentioned it, so who knows, that might end up being super powerful one day. But I had listened to your buddy Eric Davis's podcast. What's the
Expanding Mind.
Expanding Minds, which is really, really interesting podcast. And one of the things I like about him is his references are kind of similar to like what Tony Burgess's references are. You know, it's kind of, Tony Burgess was a punk rocker and he was interested in esotericism and mysticism and weird cultures. So all this stuff sort of bubbles up, and Pontypool is really a film for a particular type of Gen X counterculturalist, you know, more than anything else. Or, you know, maybe I'm just responding to that because that's kind of how I am. But Eric Davis had this dude on named Florian Kramer, who's a filmmaker, and they were talking about all of this meme culture and how it really represents nihilism, and how nihilism is seeping into our culture and it's kind of taking over everything. And the ultimate end of nihilism is just destruction, really, you know, which is kind of like the zombies in this film. Like their language virus is ultimately a nihilism virus. Like it's the complete dissipation of meaning from reality, and the words no longer mean anything, which is kind of like, you know, there's your Jacques Derrida paper for you, you know, like loss of meaning in Pontypool. But one of the things that Florian Kramer says is like, I want anarchism and nihilism in my art, but not in my banking or in my politics. And that's kind of, you know, you think of Grant Mazzy as this like performative anarchist where he's coming in, giving people the real talk, showing them what's what. And Sydney Breyer resists that. She's a conservative voice in the booth, and she's asserting this conservatism to conceal like the weirdness and badness of the town, really. Like she doesn't want people to know who's a pedophile. She doesn't want people to know who is a drunk. She's trying to stop this. And, you know, ultimately you imagine like what would have Grant Mazzy's career looked like 2 years from now in this town of like 600 people? You know, what secrets would he expose? And he's like, yeah, you have to make them mad, which is kind of a very Howard Stern thing. Mm-hmm. I don't remember the film Private Parts. There's a scene where Paul Giamatti's character is like yelling at him, and somebody hands him some numbers, and the Howard Stern show is like, yeah, the person who loves him listens for half an hour, and the person who hates him listens for 2 hours. So that's like the shock jock thing. And it's kind of like the modern political commentator thing too. Like all these modern people, like your Steven Crowders and your Rachel Maddows and all of them, they're all trafficking in this sort of shock jock political voice. And it seems like that style of communication is completely taken over the airways. It's become its own virus. And I don't know. I mean, I don't know if it's fair to shoehorn that into the analysis of this movie or not.
Well, I think it's right there. I mean, he is a shock jock. He is entered into this world where he is parsing out meaning from lack of meaning, mm-hmm. where he is, again, you know, fighting the agents of chaos with another form of chaos.
Yeah, like real talk. He's giving it to him straight.
Right.
You know?
And I think that's totally fair. I think that this may not speak to now exactly, but I think it speaks to how we got here mm-hmm. to a large extent.
Yeah, I mean, because now, I mean, who knows if you're listening to this in the future, this might not be a thing. But right now, the whole idea of like fake news is really a big deal. And honestly, like the mainstream media cooked up this fake news meme, and it was immediately stolen by the other side and redirected at them. So like basically, I think about CNN was running stories on Twitter personalities who were problematic. And so they had a whole bunch of their tweets, you know, kind of like screen captured in the way, I guess you like can use HTML to have the actual tweet show up. So what all these dudes did was just change all their material to CNN is fake news. So CNN had embedded their tweets into their story about fake news. And then when you look at their story over and over again is this like weird little Twitter virus of handles saying CNN is fake news. So that it like completely inverts the point of the article, and like it almost like steals the flag. And so, I mean, the whole idea of meme war is just super interesting to me, but also probably to me the most depressing thing out there right now.
Pressing or depressing?
Depressing.
Yeah.
pressing and depressing, I guess.
Yep.
You know, especially when it gets wrapped into like all the weird mysticism of it, like people who are like worshiping like frog gods and stuff. I mean, it's just so bizarre. But I don't know. I mean, like maybe what we're experiencing now is like its own type of language virus.
That's fair. Well, you know, I mean, and going back to where we started with Burroughs and that very idea, I mean, I feel like we're always, not to be too hokey, but we're always in a moment of realizing how prescient William Burroughs was with a lot of his ideas.
Yeah.
And I feel like we're living through a moment of seeing just how right he was in yet another way.
Yeah, and I'm also like doing a little bit of work like retroactively inoculating myself from this like adoration of him had, because I was sold on his genius for a really long time and probably still am to a certain extent, but also more than that, just the myth of him I find very fascinating. I mean, like, you know, I'm into cool suits and guns, you know, and, you know, I like the idea of this like gentleman drug addict, and, you know, I find the mythology of his stories to be pretty compelling. And in fact, like how many horror writers kind of jump off from Lovecraft as their like point of mythology. I'd say some of my horror writing really jumps off from William S. Burroughs a little bit. You know, there's the idea of interzone, the idea of intergalactic control, that like not only like the nihilism of H.P. Lovecraft, where there is only unknowable cosmic horror, is cool, but I find the idea that there is only cosmic bureaucracy even more horrifying, and that the only way to slip out of that system is to like make a beast of yourself, or to make an artist of yourself, like that has like that kind of like Bacchanalian parallel. But then again, that whole like rock and roll thing's a lie too, because William Burroughs didn't write shit until he kicked heroin. You know, like all of his great work was done in mostly in sobriety. So
yeah, well, I mean, I think that, saying the most obvious thing, that's another way in which Pontypool is super fascinating, is it does bring us into this what if Burroughs was far more influential on sci-fi and horror than someone like Lovecraft. And well, this is an example of that. Well, you get Pontypool, which I think speaks very highly of Bill's legacy.
Yeah, and again, interesting that Burgess just over and over again seemed to be so dismissive of it. But, you know, then again, a moment ago, I was super dismissive of his legacy, and then immediately said, I'm writing a thing that's sort of based on it. You know,
yeah,
so
and I talked shit about Burroughs, 3 episodes ago or something?
Yeah,
so.
Yeah. I wonder if we'll see a resurgence of interest in his work. Because I really lately, it fell off. It was very much, and the reason why I say this is William Burroughs was very tied up with grunge culture, you know, especially with the heroin thing. And now that we're seeing, like, I've been seeing like all these girls on Instagram, like having like little fashion splash pages of like Courtney Love. Like Courtney Love's a thing again. Usually when an icon comes back, their influences come back as well. So I'm curious if we'll get a Burroughs renaissance anytime soon.
Are we ready?
Are we ready? Is it after the fact? But I mean, because one of the things that's so interesting about Burroughs is his like the way he uses queerness is like this like othering protocol. Like he's always kind of pushing the listener away with this explicit description of like homosexual acts. He's like almost trying to gross you out with it, and you get the feeling that maybe he was even grossed out by his own queerness in a weird sort of way. But now we have post Will and Grace queerness, so like how does that work? You know, like is that whole like thing that happens in William Burroughs's books, is it even acceptable now? You know?
Yeah, don't know. It's so complicated.
Yeah, maybe I'll have to reread one of those damn books again.
I think one little thing backing up a little, you know, talking about memes and such, is the way in which in Pontypool these very simplistic repetitions short circuit the brain, or the brain is short circuited and can only do these simplistic repetitions. And that, to me, another way in which that speaks to the current political climate is the way in which our recent election was dictated by single words, by ending every statement with a single word, with not using complicated ideas or language, so that it created consensus through ultra simplistic repetition, which, to my mind, short circuits the brain and undoes a grasp on reality and a grasp on comprehension.
Well, that's what I do for a living, literally. You know, I make advertising. I use black magic, as Alan Moore says. And the whole idea of alliteration and poetic movements and short, tight words, all of my copywriting, I've been moving more in that direction, and it's been more successful. And I found that, like, I use basically a combination of short burst alliteration with the rules of writing from George Orwell's Politics in the English Language. And so I'm creating these super, super tight arguments that I ultimately want to have effect in the world. I want you to do something, usually buy something. And I had been kind of inching towards like sort of just stumbling across this sort of stuff. And then I ran across two really interesting neuroscience papers just written about like why all this shit works. And, you know, the consumer part of your brain, the part that lights up when you want something, also lights up for alliteration. So you can't go too much with it because you don't want all your shit to sound like Dr. Seuss, but you can use it sparingly and it's super powerful and it works. I mean, and if that's not a language virus, I don't know what the fuck is. Advertising, the ultimate language virus.
Yeah. Let's fade to black and roll the credits.
As always, please go over to iTunes or whatever the hell you're listening to this on and give us a 5-star rating. It's the way we spread our particular brand of language virus into the world. And
teach someone how to podcast listen and get them to do the same.
And if you're showing them on their device, go ahead and have them leave us a 5-star review too.
So easy.
So easy. All right, thank you guys.
See you next time for Green Room with our special guest, Eugene Robinson, who I'm going to go see perform in 20 minutes.
Awesome.
Have a nice day. Let's fade to black.
Word virus.